Hello, and welcome to our mini lecture for week 9, which I'm calling Why is Beethoven So Great? I imagine that if you had only heard of one classical composer before you came to this class, it was probably Beethoven. And his music occupies really a very special place in our culture. So I'm not sure anybody can fully answer this question, but I'm going to try to provide at least a few ideas as we go along. I think that one reason people revere Beethoven is because his life story is, in many ways, very compelling. Um, and your book goes over a lot of these points, but there are a few things I want to highlight. Beethoven really burst onto the musical scene in Vienna. He moved to Vienna from his home in Germany, um, and he was very exciting to the Viennese public because he was a very charismatic performer at the piano, and he played a lot of his own compositions. But I think uh, he made his name first as a performer, um, and initially after he made plans to study composition with Mozart. But unfortunately, Beethoven's mother passed away back in Germany, and he had to go home. And by the time he was able to return to Vienna, Mozart had passed away. So he was not able to study with Mozart, and that's one of the great what ifs of classical music. If those two personalities could have gotten together and worked together, they were both rather temperamental individuals, so it's questionable whether how they would have gotten along. But instead, Beethoven studied with Haydn, um, and Haydn was an old man at this point. He was kind of a revered master. He was famous in his own right. And so he had sort of a set plan for how he wanted Beethoven to study. And Beethoven was very rebellious. He didn't want to do a lot of the exercises that Haydn wanted him to do. Um, so initially, they had a very tumultuous relationship, but later in his career, Beethoven really acknowledged his debt to Haydn, and people who analyze Beethoven's music see a lot of the influence of Haydn in Beethoven's own style. Um, Beethoven also sort of pioneered a new relationship between the composer and the people who pay for music. That's what I mean when I write on the slide new patronage system. Patronage is just a way of talking about who pays for music, who pays for performances, who pays for music to be written. Um, and we've talked about in the classical period, there were more public concerts. The growing middle class was helping fund music, and that had an influence on musical style. But to really make a living as a composer, you often still had to have the support of the nobility. And Haydn, worked for a single nobleman most of his life, and he was treated as a servant. He wore the same clothes as the people who cooked the food and opened the door, and Mozart was sort of a strong personality and couldn't handle that type of situation, and Beethoven definitely was a strong personality and couldn't handle that type of situation. So Beethoven actually managed to get several members of the Viennese aristocracy to give him basically a stipend, a lifetime stipend, to do whatever he wanted artistically. As long as he kept writing music, they would keep supporting him. And that really gave him a freedom that other composers had not had previously. Beethoven, unlike Mozart, was a really good businessman, so he managed to work this out for himself, and it really allowed him artistic license in a very special way. Um, he also his sort of refusal to be subjected to the whims of the aristocracy um, was also related to his politics. He was a firm believer in the democratic movements that were rising up across Europe. You've already read about how he was initially excited when Napoleon rose to power in France, believing that Napoleon would bring democracy to France, and then was so disappointed when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, became a dictator. But really, throughout his life, Beethoven believed in democracy and in the fundamental worth of all individuals. Um, and that really animates his music in some interesting ways. And finally, I think maybe the most compelling aspect of Beethoven's biography is that he suffered the worst calamity that could befall a musician, which is that he went deaf at a rather young age. Um, it ended his performing career. It did not happen all at once. It happened over a period of several years. Of course, Beethoven noticed it first, and then his close friends started to notice, and then eventually everybody noticed. So he had to retire as a performer because he could no longer really hear what he was doing when he was playing. But he continued to compose. And that idea of overcoming such a tremendous obstacle, to have an artistic vision that could not be stifled by something so horrendous, is, I think, one of the things that makes Beethoven's story and his music really inspiring. So, turning to Beethoven's compositions, as your book points out, his compositional output falls neatly into three periods. And in part, that's because there were some years where Beethoven didn't write much music. So, between the early period and the middle period, there were several years where he didn't write because that was when he went deaf. And between the middle and the late period, the same. In that case, it was because he attempted to adopt his nephew after his brother passed away, and that was not a good arrangement. Beethoven was not a great parent figure, as you might imagine, but that took up a lot of his time, and he didn't write a lot of music then either. Beethoven's early period, often known as the period of imitation, because he wrote in the forms and genres popular at the time, so the same types of pieces that we studied with Haydn and Mozart. However, the name is a little bit misleading because Beethoven always had his own very personal compositional style. So it wasn't like he was just turning out a copy of Mozart or Haydn, but he was composing in the same forms and genres as they were. In the heroic period, a lot of his music has a sense of struggle and triumph, and that's why this period gets its name. Symphony Number 5 is part of the heroic period. And then the late period is very enigmatic. Beethoven's music becomes, in many ways, rather eccentric. Beethoven was almost completely isolated by his deafness at this point in his life. There was no sign language at this point. So if when people came over to visit him, he would have them write in a book and hold up what they wanted to say because he couldn't hear them. And then he would just respond verbally. And those conversation books are one of the things that scholars study when they study Beethoven because they have this written record of half of the conversation. It's like sort of hearing half of a phone call, but you could kind of tell what Beethoven might have said in between. So that's rather interesting, I think. Symphony Number 9 is part of the late period of Beethoven's works. So let's talk about what makes Beethoven's musical style particularly unique. Some of the things that made Beethoven's music so exciting for his audiences one was his sense of contrast. Beethoven loves contrast. Fast and slow, loud and soft, contrasts of texture, pretty much any type of musical contrast you could think of. And Beethoven's contrasts are shocking, striking, really dramatic. Also, Beethoven's music often has a very strong rhythmic character. I just here wrote driving rhythm. Just there's an energy and a vitality in the rhythmic quality of Beethoven's pieces that was very exciting for his listeners. Beethoven also was very innovative in the way he treated harmony. He experimented with modulations to distant keys that were very unexpected. Keys that share a lot of notes in the scale we think of as closely related, but keys that don't share a lot of notes in their scales we think of as distantly related. And Beethoven often seemed to try to go to the furthest possible reaches of harmony to really surprise and shock his audiences. He also really experimented with form, and particularly in his heroic and in his late period, he took the forms of classical music that we have studied and really expands and alters them in some very personal ways. And then this last item on my list, Beethoven was really adept at taking very small musical ideas, very brief motives, and exploring all the possibilities of that motive, developing it in all kinds of different ways. And we're going to study how he does that in the Fifth Symphony. And I think that's part of what makes the Fifth Symphony so important. So, the first thing you hear in the Fifth Symphony is the same musical motive repeated twice. And I want you to imagine if you had never heard that before and Beethoven walked up to you and said, "Hey, listen to the great melody that I just wrote for my new symphony." You might be expecting something, that you would walk away whistling or humming the tune. And it's just this little thing that goes na 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 na, and you're like, there's not a lot there, Beethoven. But Beethoven's going to prove you wrong, because every single melody almost in this first movement is built up out of that one musical idea. It's almost relentless the way that he keeps returning to that motive over and over, building every motive out of every melody, I should say, out of it. Beethoven includes some surprises in the way that he handles the sonata allegro form of this movement. It's a minor key movement. So the exposition moves from first theme in minor, which is the theme I just played for you. And then the second theme, which is announced by the French horns, is in major, as we would expect. It has that shift from minor to major for the second theme area. When that music comes back in the recapitulation, we would expect that the second theme would now be in the tonic minor key. But Beethoven doesn't do that. He leaves that second theme in a major key in the recapitulation, which is surprising and makes it seem like maybe the movement's just going to come out in major at that point. So Beethoven repeats all the second theme area of the recapitulation. It's staying in a major key. But then at the final cadence of what would be the end of the piece, Beethoven adds a coda section. Coda is just the Latin word for tail. And it's any section that is added at the end after the requirements of the form, in this case sonata allegro form, have been finished. And Beethoven's coda in the first movement is almost as long as the development section. And it basically returns the movement to its original minor key, its tonic minor key, in a way that almost to me seems kind of crushing. Again, relentless. That is kind of an example of how Beethoven brings drama to his handling of a familiar form. One other detail to note, right at the start of the recapitulation, as after announcing the first theme, Beethoven allows the orchestra to pause. Everybody is silent, and one instrument, the oboe, takes a solo. And it's a very striking moment and very unusual. And I'm not really sure what the expressive intent is there. I'd like you to think about it when you hear it, what that solo sounds like. Does it sound lonely or defiant? Or I want you to think of it when you hear it. It is surprising that it appears, because there's nothing like it in the exposition. So it's another example of Beethoven shocking his listeners. The second movement of Symphony No. 5 begins with a very lyrical melody played by the cellos, and it's a stark contrast to the very motivic, very energetic quality of the first movement. It's kind of a respite from what you've just heard. And this melody, as it turns out, is the theme of a theme and variations, and Beethoven presents successive variations on it. But before each variation, the theme and variations form is interrupted by another melody. And this melody is announced first by the woodwinds, and then again, as sort of a really loud fanfare, by the brass. And this melody actually contains the short, long motive from the beginning of the first movement. Here's what it sounds like. it may not strike you that that is related to right away, but it has the same rhythmic character. Short, 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 long. So it's like that motive, even though you thought you were done with it, it's going to crop up in unexpected places throughout the entire piece. This is really an unusual character, an unusual feature of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Other symphonies, frequently the movements were related to each other in terms of key. They might share some thematic relationships, but this continuous return to a single idea is really unusual in the symphonies of the 18th century. So Beethoven, in case you missed it, that's why those trumpet fanfares are so loud in the slow movement, and they do kind of interrupt the peaceful quality with this announcement of the short, 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 long motive. The third movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony follows the same ternary pattern that we would expect from the minuet trio movements of Haydn or Mozart. But like a lot of Beethoven symphonies, not just Symphony Number 5, instead of writing the courtly dance, the minuet, Beethoven writes a much more rhythmically energetic movement known as a scherzo. Scherzo is from the Italian word for joke, and it often denoted a light-hearted kind of piece. Beethoven's scherzos are frequently not as much lighthearted and often instead quite driving and rhythmic. And this one is no exception. It returns the minor key of the first movement and starts out rather spooky and mysterious, but almost right away, the French horns announce the short, 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 long motive. It's kind of a fanfare type figure. And that takes care of the A section. That material is used throughout the A section. The B section of this ternary form is actually a fugue that's started off by the cellos and basses, and it is an extraordinarily difficult, technically difficult part for the basses in particular to play. If you want a symphony orchestra job as a bass player, you're almost certainly going to have to demonstrate that you can play the B section of this movement because it is very difficult. And Beethoven often demanded very difficult technical performances from the different instruments in the orchestra in his symphonies. When the A section returns, all the same musical material from the beginning returns, but Beethoven reorchestrates it. So instead of being a loud fanfare type character, it's soft and mysterious, and he uses the pizzicato strings in place of the horns that you heard the first time. So it really creates a different character, even though you're listening to the same melodies that you heard before. And then perhaps the most unusual thing about the third movement is that there is a lengthy transition passage where the strings are just holding a chord, so that movement 4 follows directly on after movement 3, after this transition, with no pause. And during that transition passage, you'll hear the timpani playing the short, 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 long motive, almost like a heartbeat. And at the end of the transition, there's a huge crescendo that takes us into the fourth movement. In the 18th century, there were a lot of minor key symphonies that started out with a minor key in the first movement, where the last movement transitions to a major key, so that it ends on kind of a hopeful note. But Beethoven's Fifth Symphony takes that contrast and expands it to the maximum amount. So the last movement is as bright and triumphant as the first and the third movements were dark and foreboding and ominous. So it begins with a huge brass fanfare in a major key. So the whole symphony is kind of this transition from minor to major, almost from darkness to light. And Beethoven uses the sonata allegro form again for this last movement as sort of a balance, to the sonata allegro of the first movement. And at first you may think that this movement doesn't really feature the short, 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 long motive, but the second theme of the sonata allegro form, the strings play this. And each one of those is short, 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 long, short, 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 long, short, 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 long. It's sped up. It feels quite different, but it's still the short, 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 long motive. So it's as if this motive that was so scary at the beginning of the piece has been transformed into something completely different. One of the most surprising moments in this movement is that a piece of the third movement actually returns in the fourth movement. At the end of the development section, Beethoven returns some of the scherzo music. And again, I'm not sure why he decided to do that. It's very peculiar. And you might think about, what expressive effect do you think Beethoven was trying to achieve by doing that? In the middle of this celebration, this dark, mysterious music comes back. Beethoven also, in this final movement, adds several instruments that only play in the last movement. He adds the piccolo flute to the flute section, and the piccolo player only plays in this fourth movement. You sit there for 20 minutes waiting to play, and then you get to play. Also the contrabassoon, so the lowest woodwind instrument, lowest pitched woodwind instrument, is added. And he also adds 3 trombones to the brass section to kind of give more power to this last movement. And expanding the instrumentation at the end is something that was rather unique for this symphony at its time. Like the first movement, there is an extended coda section that wraps up this movement and confirms its joyous character. So I spent a good amount of time talking through this movement. I would encourage you, instead of listening to the 4 movements of Beethoven, the Beethoven Symphony in your book, that instead you listen to a performance that was given just a few weeks ago by the Philadelphia Orchestra. It's available right now online. The link is on the slide. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is the second piece on the program. It begins at 10 minutes and 8 seconds in, and you'll just have to, there's a timeline at the bottom, so you can scroll across and start there. It is a dynamic performance. It was given to an empty concert hall because of the coronavirus epidemic, and the orchestra went ahead and played. This was early, before social distancing had completely taken effect, so the orchestra went ahead and played for broadcast. And it was the last thing that the orchestra played, the Philadelphia Orchestra played before they went on hiatus. It's a remarkable performance. And I think if you read about this piece in your book and listen to what I just talked about, then I think this performance will be more meaningful to you than the one that is included in the active listening guides in your book. So you can skip the active listening guides in your book and instead watch this performance. I do want you to be able to identify the 4 movements of the symphony. So be sure to listen to all 4 all the way through. Here is the additional listening page, the classical and romantic folder, and there you can see the link to Beethoven Symphony No. 5. It says complete. That is the link that you need to follow to that Philadelphia Orchestra performance. And I'd also like you to listen to a recent performance of the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and that's the link right underneath. This is a performance by the Berlin Philharmonic from last summer. And the Berlin Philharmonic is also on hiatus because of the epidemic. But they have made all of their archive performances available to the public. Usually you have to pay a subscription to see this, but it's free right now. So if you click on that link, you can hear their performance of Symphony No. 9. I believe you will have to register on the site by providing your email address, but it's free, completely free, and you can opt out of any emails from them. And you can just follow that link. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is also quite special for a variety of reasons. One of the main ones is that the last movement features a choir. So you'll see underneath the link to the symphony, there is the text of the German poem that the choir sings. So you'll want to open that up and maybe have it in a window next to the window where you're watching the performance. You can follow along in the text. The fourth movement of Beethoven's Symphony Number 9 is the final movement of Beethoven's last symphony. It begins with a very dissonant sounding fanfare. Um, and immediately after, the cellos and basses have a melody. That melody is actually marked in the style of a recitative. So Beethoven is alluding to the melodic quality of recitative from opera. And really, in many ways, he brings that type of dramatic expression that we associate with opera into his symphonies here in a very explicit way. Um, and what follows this cello and bass melody is a quote of the music that Beethoven used in the first movement of Symphony Number 9. And after that brief quote, the cellos and basses interrupt again. Um, and then the orchestra plays a little bit of the music from the second movement of Symphony Number 9, and the cellos and basses interrupt again. And then they play a little bit of the music of the third movement of Symphony Number 9. And each time the cellos and basses interrupt, almost as if they're rejecting the music that the orchestra has already played. And finally, the cellos and basses play the theme of what becomes a theme in variations. And it's stated first in the low strings, and then moves to the upper strings, and eventually the whole orchestra plays it. It's a very familiar melody to many of us. Beethoven took many years to write it, as simple as it seems. He went through a lot of drafts before he settled on this one. And after the orchestra has presented it, so the fanfare comes back from the opening, and then vocal soloists begin to sing, and the melody is taken up by those soloists and eventually by a choir, and Beethoven uses it to set the text of a poem by one of his German contemporaries titled "Ode to Joy." And Beethoven takes the stanzas of this poem that really relate to the idea of the sort of the universal brotherhood, and one might add sisterhood, of all humankind. And adding the choir, Beethoven really transcends the genre of symphony. You know, I've taught you that the symphony is a genre for orchestra alone. But by adding a choir, Beethoven turns the symphony into something else, maybe more like an oratorio, where it's a deep statement of kind of his own personal philosophy here. And Beethoven uses some of the same tricks as he does in the last movement of Symphony Number 5. There are certain instruments that only play in the last movement, the piccolo again, the contrabassoon, and some percussion instruments, the bass drum, the triangle, and one that I left off the slide, the cymbals. And those instruments are designed to sound like the music of a Turkish military band. The Turks were the Austrians' political enemies at this time. They were fighting a war. So by including those instruments, Beethoven is really reaching out to people who are like as far at the opposite end of the political spectrum as he possibly could. So it's a very striking moment. On this slide, I've indicated the timing in the recording where the Turkish march occurs. And actually, I should mention on the previous Symphony Number 5 slides, I include the timings for various moments in the Philadelphia Orchestra performance, so you can find those if you need to. As you're listening to these pieces, I want you to think about, why is Beethoven's music still relevant? Is it still relevant? Remember that Beethoven wrote this final symphony, Number 9, in almost complete isolation because of his deafness. And I know a lot of us are experiencing feelings of isolation and loneliness right now in our current situation. And I want you to think about what Beethoven came up with out of that isolation, this final movement, this choral movement of this last symphony. Does it speak to you? What do you think Beethoven was trying to say, and why are these pieces still so meaningful for our culture? So with those thoughts in your mind, I hope you enjoy some Beethoven listening this week.